Hey all, I wanted to record the lecture on Lovecraft because if I don't record it soon, I'm gonna just fall into a black hole of reading Lovecraft stuff, and that seems not great for anyone involved. So, um, HP Lovecraft, Howard Phillips Lovecraft, born 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, which is where he lived almost all of his life. He spent some time in New York, but hated it and kind of retreated to Providence. So Lovecraft was child of rich parents, but his family's fortune was kind of in decline. It is worth noting that he never actually made a living as a writer. It's sort of worth noting. I don't know. It's worth knowing about him. But he's fairly prolific, mostly short fiction with a couple novella length pieces. So let's see. We've got the big old annotated and the new annotated. Just and that even those don't reprint all of his work. And one thing that I want to note that I didn't mention in the lecture on the horror at Red Hook is that is a story that was not often reprinted, and in fact is not in the big annotated Lovecraft. It is in the newer edition that has a foreword by Victor Lavelle. So let's talk a little about his work because his biography is not that interesting. He sat at home, he wrote stories, he sold them uh, mostly to magazines. I think what was the one? Shadow at Innsmouth. Shadow over Innsmouth. I think is the only one that he saw published as a freestanding paperback during his life. I could be wrong, and maybe at the Mountains of Madness too. Um, so the concerns of Lovecraft, or what he's known for, is what's called a sort of cosmic horror or weird horror. And I think a lot of people he has a large uh, he has a huge influence on science fiction and fantasy and horror. And I think a lot of people think of him as being as sort of coming out of nowhere, and that's not at all true. He's a huge, he has a lot of influence from Edgar Allan Poe, particularly the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym, which is Poe's only novel that nobody really reads because it's weird and also pretty racist. But it's about a trip to it's about an expedition to the Antarctic where they discover a hidden race of people. And at the Mountains of Madness, which is arguably Lovecraft's most famous work, is kind of an homage to the narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. I know we don't generally, if you've read Poe, you probably don't think of him as a weird writer with monsters and stuff. His horror is generally not quite supernatural, but more supernatural influence. But he does have stuff that is sort of proto weird. And then from there, Lovecraft is drawing a lot on Arthur Machen, who is a British author, obviously slightly earlier than Lovecraft. It's tough to be influenced by authors that come after you. But Machen's work tends to deal with a sort of an ancient evil that has lived from, has survived from the past into the present. In addition, Robert Chambers, who does a sort of dark, weird horror, and the other big influence, although he sort of comes in later for Lovecraft's career, is Lord Dunsany, who he writes stories about dream gods. Basically, there's like a whole mythology and a pantheon of these gods that exist in an outer dream realm. So what we see with Lovecraft is, and what makes him interesting, and at the same time makes him problematic, is there's this intersection of a whole lot of things. He is really interested in the sciences, and very often his narrators are scientists of some ilk, and a lot of times they will interact with artists who have more direct experiences of the horrors that they're talking about, or that the stories are about. Pickman's model is one where there's sort of a lot of the stories are sort of framed with a scientific narrator who talks to an artist who's had like a vision of eldritch horrors. So he's really interested in sciences, and he's really interested in new developments in science, in mechanical technology, but particularly in biology and in astronomy, not astrology. That's the birth sign thing. Sorry, I have a Libra tattoo. That's what I'm gesturing towards. He was a really avid sort of amateur astronomer. So a lot of these elder gods that he talks about in his sort of more well known work are located in space. In space. Sorry, it's obligatory. Just something that you have to do. So you have an interest in new ideas and new concepts of in astronomy and new observations in astronomy. You have new developments in biology. Some of these have to do with racial biology and eugenics. Frankly, he has, you know, if you do opt to read the horror at Red Hook, you'll see he's taxonomical in his racism. He's like putting people in tiny little classes and boxes, and this has to do with the kind of biological race theory that he is interested in. But he's also really interested in Jungian in Carl Jung's theory of dreams and the ability of dreams to render or discover truth. And what sort of forms a foundation of Lovecraft's storytelling and what he's really good at is this idea that if Carl Jung introduces the idea that through dreams we can discover an inner truth, that there is this inner dreaming, and Lovecraft's idea flips that to some extent, that we can use dreams to discover an outer truth. So very often in Lovecraft stories, characters are receiving or having described to them visions of unimaginable elder dark gods. Then you bring into this his racism and his xenophobia, and another weird thing happens, because what he's scared of is the encroachment of encroachment by people of color, by non-white people into his community, or into white America. But they always have to be conceived as sort of savage, as from the past. And then at a larger scale, the point of fear within the stories is these elder gods that are from the past, that are mapped onto sort of ancient religions, returning to destroy all of us. So it is really like, we have talked and will talk about separating the art from the artist, and I don't think that you can prize Lovecraft's xenophobia and racism out of the work, because even when he's not directly talking about his views on race, it's that fear that has sort of gotten twisted in his head. It's that fear of the like dark, returning unknown that drives his stories, and he extrapolates that into this mythology. It's called, I'm mispronouncing it because it's designed to be a word unpronounceable by human mouths. The Cthulhu mythos, which is this whole mythology of like elder gods and shoggoths and like lesser elder gods, because even the elder gods have slaves in Lovecraft's mind. So he takes his nightmares and throws them out into the cosmos, and establishes them as having been there for a really long time. And I think part of it, to go back to, so there is a fear of racial or demographic displacement, which should be really familiar to those of us in the current political climate. But there is also, as astronomy expands ideas of how big the universe is, the counterpoint to that is that your understanding of yourself as human becomes smaller and smaller and smaller. So Lovecraft, his creativity really derives from being someone who is a scared little man, scared of people who are different from him, scared of a universe that seems mechanistic and automated and impossibly huge, and left sort of alone with his cat, who has a racial slur for a name, and so that's sort of the overview on Lovecraft. You can see influence of his work, it's kind of impossible to avoid in a lot of horror and fantasy. Anytime you see like the monster that is sort of too big to be imagined, that's largely a Lovecraftian conceit and construct or concept. Uh, what else do I want to add about him? He is another person who used to have a major award named after him, and that was taken away due to his views on race. Um, his views on race are pretty much undeniable. There are apologists, and one of the methods of apology was he was married to a Jewish woman, and so people are like, he can't be anti-Semitic. He was married to a Jewish woman, but that is the "I have a black friend" argument, and that's complete nonsense. He died fairly young. He died at 47 of intestinal cancer because he was afraid of doctors and didn't go to the doctor. Um, and that's pretty much it. He's a fairly divisive figure um, within writing communities, and how we deal with him, because there is an urge, I think, to take the good stuff and move forward with it and change it. And I really think that Laval is one of the best and one of the clearest at doing that. But there are a number of projects. I mean, Lovecraft Country, which is based on a book but is also now a TV series, is an obvious one. There are a lot of films and books and projects that do manage to take this idea of like dark elder gods and subtract the racism from it, or abstract it enough away from its original source, that they can play with these ideas and not have to acknowledge some of the stuff that I think is baked into them. And this is why I picked Ballad of Black Tom, is because it barrels directly at what Lovecraft is doing and says like, yes, I do want to have all the cool stuff, and yes, I am going to work through the bad stuff to get to it. And I'm going to talk more about Ballad of Black Tom in the next lecture, but that is sort of my overview on H.P. Lovecraft.